Hello from Qatar, dear Motorsport-Magazin.com friends and Formula One fans. There was one dominant theme on Media Day here, namely the imminent Andretti entry. Earlier this week, the FIA finally announced the news of how Phase 2 of the application process turned out. Andretti made it past Phase 2. In the first phase, it was just a matter of roughly checking out who was interested. It was relatively inexpensive, costing only $30,000 to look at the whole thing. 4 of the 7 original applicants were left in Phase 2, which was a bit more cost-intensive, with $300,000, and Andretti made it. 3 applicants were rejected, but they were not named publicly, but of course we have known for a long time who they were. Lucky Sons, the former Pantera Team Asia, High-Tech, and Rodan Carlin. I'm also curious to know whether the last word has been spoken. Of course, they are anything but happy, and a lot of money has already been invested. But Andretti is at least happy for the time being. Of course, they have already invested a lot of money. They have teamed up with General Motors, i.e. with the Cadillac brand. That was already a statement. They were able to convince the FIA, and the process took a very long time. We have heard that they really went through a lot of files, that they asked questions about everything to see if they were a proper candidate. The FIA was relatively sure from the beginning that they would be, but they still took their time. They wanted to make sure everything was really watertight. Why? Because they knew that things would get a bit more difficult in Phase 3. For one thing, you need permission from the FIA to participate in Formula 1. That was Phase 2. But then you also need a commercial agreement. And it's not the FIA that's responsible for that, but Formula 1. And it was already foreseeable that this would be a bit more complicated. And here in the paddock, that was reflected again today. For the most part, unfortunately, you have to say that the drivers are puppets of their teams. They said, well, do we really need another team? George Russell said, if we do need it, it has to be quality over quantity, and so on. So very reserved reaction there as well. Andretti, of course, is an absolutely huge name in motorsports, along with Cadillac. So clearly it's not Ferrari. In terms of commitment, it's initially built on the fact that they have a customer engine, a lot of customer parts. First of all, that's still expandable, but that's not just anybody. This is not the same as in 2010 when we had teams like Virgin or Caterham. It's quite a different situation. Still, Formula 1 is reacting very reserved, except I have to say for 2 drivers I heard today who had a relatively clear, different opinion. Valtteri Bottas, for example, openly said, yes, it's great, 1 more team, 2 more seats. That might also bring a bit of momentum to the driver market, and Max Verstappen saw the whole thing realistically. He said he can understand it from the team's point of view, but from the driver's point of view, it's actually something else. It's actually nice to see a bit more going on again. Why are the other teams against it, and why is Formula 1 against it? Looking at Formula 1, no one is really 100% sure, because it wouldn't cost Formula 1 a penny more, at least not initially, to have an additional team. The teams, on the other hand, would lose money, because there is a certain share of the revenue that Formula 1 generates, which is distributed among all the teams. If an 11th team is now added, the cake doesn't necessarily grow, but it is divided into several parts. And that's why the existing teams are afraid that they'll get less money out of the Formula 1 pot and will have to share it. Formula 1 does not have to increase this pot. That could then all come with the new Concord Agreement in 2026, so that's a very interesting topic. Currently, it's still the case that Andretti would have to buy in to keep the whole thing from getting too watered down. Anti-dilution fee, 200 million, valid up to and including 2025. Then from 2026 onwards, there are already 600 million in the room. Others think that this should not be the case at all. Because there is also the EU, which once stated in a directive from the year 2000 that teams must be allowed to enter Formula 1, that it must not be a closed circle, so to speak. So there are still many topics that are being discussed, but Formula 1 is taking the side of the teams and saying, well, wait a minute, we have to check this carefully. On the other hand, of course, there are voices that say, wait a minute, what do you have to check exactly? New teams have to check with the FIA whether they are complying with all the guidelines, whether they can be a proper team. The FIA has now confirmed that in a very detailed process. Now all they really have to do is to see when Cadillac and Andretti want to join and then simply sign a commercial agreement. So it's a very interesting topic that will probably keep Formula 1 on its toes for many months to come. I'll be curious to see how it plays out. I think it's all going to be highly political, even though it already is. But now onto the sport. You may have seen it already. It's a pretty spectacular paddock. When we were here in Qatar for the first time 2 years ago with Formula 1, it all looked a bit different. But in the meantime, apart from the circuit itself, everything here has been turned inside out. It's a huge, gigantic project. Several $100 million have been invested and everything has been redone except for the track, but it has been completely resurfaced. And the main grandstand is actually identical to the one before. An absolute mega project. Not everything is really finished yet. It looks reasonably okay now, but the whole project was very last minute. No matter where you look, a lot of details are not yet the way they're supposed to be. There's not only new asphalt now, there's also drainage for once. MotoGP, which originally raced on this track, has already suffered from rain and the race had to be postponed until Monday. This won't happen to Formula One, so that was a major task here. Not only the infrastructure, not only making the hospitalities look beautiful, building some more grandstands, but also the track. And as far as the track is concerned, there is also some criticism. Yuki Tsunoda, for example, said that the curbs are an absolute disaster. They're floor killer curbs. Because they're so aggressive, and track limits are a big problem here. If you run over the curbs just for a bit, the floor is destroyed. You may have read about it on our website in the last few days. They actually wanted to experiment with new special curbs here to keep track limit violations in check. Track limits could be a big problem here. New runoff areas have been invented. The problem is that MotoGP and Formula One share this track. MotoGP got its way with its need to have an asphalt strip in front of the gravel bed. Formula One wanted a pure gravel bed. The track operator said, well, there are also track days here, so the gravel bed is not so great for that. That's why they said, okay, we'll make an asphalt strip for the motorcycles. But now Formula One has a track limits problem again. Then Formula One said, let's try something. In Zandvoort, it was discovered that the gravel bed was a bit of a problem at the end of the race in this small arena. That's why they put epoxy in it, consolidated it, and that worked quite well. You still lost a lot of grip. So they said, let's make concrete slabs with consolidated gravel. These are plates that can be replaced. For Formula One, they actually wanted to use these plates. For MotoGP and others, they simply wanted the flat concrete slabs. However, the decision has now been made to use the normal concrete plates. Because it's a sprint weekend on a partly new, partly old track, it was all a bit much at once. That's why they wanted to be on the safe side and will probably test this in a future race. Nevertheless, the curbs are criticized by some drivers. As Yuki Tsunoda said, he thinks the curbs will break the floor. In fact, the curbs are standardized. They are not extreme curbs, and they are also installed on other tracks. They are just negative curbs. There's a difference of 5 centimeters, but the FIA says, well, then just don't drive out so far that you hit the floor, and the problem of track limits, or at least the curbs, will be a little less than it was the year before. For one thing, the cars don't tolerate driving over the curbs so well anymore. Yuki Tsunoda is right about that. And on the other hand, race director Niels Wittig uses the white line as the track limit and not the curbs, as was the case back then. So the drivers are warning a bit about that. I don't think it will be quite as dramatic. I hope the issue with the track limits will be reasonably good here. And I hinted at it, it's a sprint weekend, the 4th sprint this season. It's with the new shootout, a great format. At least a spectacle, but it's the first time that a sprint will take place at a night race. And that has an impact because you have free practice, which will take place in incredible heat. We had 41 degrees today, absolutely brutal. The air conditioning in the media center was also not 100% ready yet. At least the regulation was not. So you have a practice in the heat, and then you go straight into qualifying at night. The race also takes place at night after sunset. Of course, the differences are enormous. You have a new track, new asphalt. You hardly know anything about how it will behave. Then there are different temperatures. Max Verstappen has always said he's not a big fan of the sprint format because it's just a bit of a gamble, because then you're immediately under Parc Fermé conditions after free practice. You have to commit yourself there. Now that more variables are added, he says it's just kind of a lottery, and that's why I'm curious. And I think that could mix up the whole field. Whether it will change that much for Red Bull remains to be seen. McLaren could actually be really strong here because of the track characteristics, but I'm curious to see whether some drivers or teams can do a little better than the others. And one of the drivers who always managed better was Max Verstappen. That's one of the reasons why he graces the cover of our new print issue. Beautiful, in my opinion. You can order it now. Here in Qatar, Verstappen could do everything better than the other drivers one more time. He could become world champion as early as Saturday in the sprint race. Some people say it's nonsense to have the world champion crowned on a Saturday, but in the history of Formula One, this has happened many times. There have also been Grands Prix on Saturday, so it wouldn't be the first time that a world champion is crowned on Saturday. He himself is relatively indifferent to it all, he said. Well, it does not come out of the blue. He is already prepared for it, whether it happens on Saturday or Sunday. He is relatively indifferent. With the champions back in the day, the Grand Prix was on Saturday. Now he couldn't really celebrate because then he also wants to drive the Grand Prix. That's what he said. He wants to win that as well. So it's very likely that the title decision will be made. I don't want to show you the maths here. You can read all about it on our website, motorsportmagazine.com. There is also a free app for Android and iOS, by the way, in which you can take a closer look at the graph